Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back, and thank you so much for your continued support. If this is the first video you're seeing on my channel since the new year started, Happy New Year, and I hope all of you had a great holiday season. It's been 50 or so days since I've posted my last video, so let's get right back into it with the Dark Archive Remastered Previews. The remaster of Dark Archive came out on the 21st of January for subscribers and reviewers, and it's something I'd say a lot of folks have been looking forward to, me included. I was excited to see what Paizo would do with the Psychic because, in my opinion, the Psychic was in need of some quality of life changes. Unfortunately, I don't think Paizo hit the mark on those changes, but let's go through it. In today's video, we will be talking about the Psychic Remaster. Now, let's make one thing clear. I am not comparing the new Psychic to the pre-errata legacy Psychic. Psychic has already received erratas for remaster compatibility. For example, Oscillating Wave Psychic lost Ray of Frost and gained Frostbite, which at the time I remember saying this is the relative buff compared to the previous Oscillating Wave Psychic. I am now only comparing what the remaster changed from what you can already access on Archives of Nethys, with the remaster compatibility errata included in there. But before we talk about the actual changes made to the Psychic, we need to have a little conversation about the misinformation going around. So I am sure anyone who is in touch with the online community has seen a lot of information and misinformation about the Psychic. Sometimes you'll see conflicting claims on the same thread and not know what to believe. If you're not aware, basically what happened here is Dark Archive PDFs released early for anyone who bought it on the weekend before Dark Archive's release. This meant that before the books came out, there were a handful of people who had the actual factual PDFs of the remastered Dark Archive in their hands. They looked at the Psychic and talked about their observations. Somebody heard, but without having looked at the PDF, continued talking, and we played a game of broken telephone to get to the point where we're at right now, where most people have a sort of incomplete and even contradictory picture of how the Psychic was changed or wasn't changed. So today, as I talk about what actually was changed for the Psychic, I will also be setting the record straight on what didn't change. First, we will talk about the misinformation on a broad level, just the big claims you've been seeing thrown around everywhere. Was the Psychic nerfed into the ground? This is a very common claim I've seen all over Reddit. The short answer is no, it wasn't. Overall, I would say the Psychic barely changed. Now, set aside for a moment whether you believe it needed buffs or not, because many people believed it needed buffs. The point is, whatever you thought of the Psychic before the release of Dark Archive Remaster, your opinion should not really change on the Psychic after, because it is pretty much the same. There were a few things that got a little better. There were a few narrowly built things that got noticeably worse, but they only affect that narrow range of builds. So ultimately, I'd say it's a bit of a wash. The majority of Psychics are going to come out feeling like nothing changed. That might feel bad, but the point is you were not nerfed into the ground. Anyone claiming that is just capitalizing on misinformation and paranoia. But misinformation in this case is going both ways. It wasn't buffed by any significant margin either. I have seen this counterclaim almost going on where like a handful of people are now claiming that the Psychic secretly got buffed a good amount. That isn't true either. It did not get significantly buffed. It got a bare minimum number of quality of life improvements, and I don't think it got as many quality of life improvements as it needed, so it got like tiny buffs overall. Anyone saying it got significantly and noticeably buffed is also spreading misinformation in this case, in my opinion, and it's important to set the record straight. The Psychic has overall stayed the same. Now, speaking of the Psychic barely changing, to some of you that's a really bad thing because many people seem to consider the Psychic to be a really bad caster. That's not an assessment I agree with. And I have seen people spread this doomer message that it's unplayably bad. I don't think it is. I think the Psychic has always been a good caster. It's never been bad. Definitely not unplayably bad. Before the remaster, I think it was convincingly above average because the gaps between classes used to be bigger before the remaster, and I think the Psychic was an above average caster. Since the remaster hit, and including considerations for the Psychic remaster compatibility errata, I would say it's perhaps a little below average, especially with some of the newer classes that have been coming out, and it's been in need of some quality of life improvements. It is disappointing that we did not receive all of the QOL changes that the Psychic could have had, but it's fine. The class is still fine. It's not unplayable because it never was. And frankly, I'm gonna soapbox a little here. There are no unplayably bad classes in the game. You can take any class and you can take it to any table, even one that runs very difficult combats in very difficult adventuring days, and there'll still be at least a few builds you can do well with. The thing that determines whether you'll do well or not is whether you know how to coordinate both your build and your gameplay with your party members rather than trying to be some solo lone wolf. The online community has a tendency of taking the most obvious and most straightforward builds and then acting like there's a massive gap between them and then the classes where sometimes the good builds are a little less obvious, a little more complex. That is not the case. If, for example, you wanted a good Blaster caster before the remaster, you might play an Oscillating Wave Psychic, as I covered in my Blaster caster's ranking video. You still can. That hasn't changed. It was always a good Blaster. It still is. Saying something is below average in the remaster means something very different than what it meant before the remaster. Before the remaster, the gaps between classes used to be much bigger. These days, a below average class is something that might struggle a little bit in certain circumstances. It might not feel as nice because it didn't get those QOL upgrades that everyone else seems to be getting, and you will still be fine in 95% of situations at tables that play very difficult games. So if you have been worried that the Psychic is unplayably bad now in the remaster, just breathe. It's fine. If you want to build a Psychic, go ahead and you'll be fine. And lastly, is the Psychic archetype dead? No, it got a justifiable nerf. Come on, the Psychic dedication was a little too much. And notably, among the people who took Psychic archetype to gain a boost in power in some way, the Magus was one of the considerations because the online community loves talking about imaginary weapon. The Magus isn't dead either. One, you don't need to be spell striking with focus spells to do well as a Magus. Two, if you want to keep spell striking with focus spells, there are other archetypes you can archetype into. You don't need to go the Psychic route. So the changes to the archetype, in my opinion, are mostly justified. I'll get into details on that later. And likewise, the Psychic did not receive all of the QOL changes I thought it needed. I'll go into detail on what I thought it needed near the end of the video. But suffice it to say, for the most part, nothing changed for base class Psychics, and for archetype ones, there were justifiable nerfs. Now let's start talking specifics. First, let's talk about Unleash Psyche, the defining feature of the Psychic. It's the feature that lets you get a huge damage bonus to spells for 2 rounds and to use your defining Psyche trait actions. How has it changed in the remaster? For this slide and for any slides for the rest of this video, feel free to pause and compare the text that I've shown you here to what's on Nethys in the weeks after this video. Most of the time, it'll be very, very similar to what's on Nethys, and Unleash Psyche is no exception. The one and only change here is that spells with a duration will now apply the boost on the initial damage of that spell. That is the only thing that has changed. There have been some claims about other things that have changed. Nothing else has changed in Unleash Psyche. This is the one and only change you're going to see in the rules. One quick note, there has been some confusion on what counts as initial damage for a spell with the duration. There are damaging spells that don't have initial damage. For example, Awaken Entropy, Frozen Fog. Their first ping of damage happens during an enemy's turn and not yours, and they do not qualify for an initial damage ping with Unleash Psyche. This only applies to spells that do some damage up front and have a duration after, like say Rouse Skeletons. Now the big deal about this is that this is, in the most theoretical sense, a huge buff to Silent Whisper. Because technically speaking, Daze was not allowed to benefit from Unleash Psyche's damage before. I cannot imagine any GMs ever ruling that way at an actual table. But hey, if you have one of the GMs who would rule that way, the glitch is now fixed. Other than fixing that glitch, is this change a big deal? Personally, I don't think so. I've seen a lot of people say this is a huge buff to the Psychic. I think it's minor. Firstly, Occult is just a little sparse on spells that have an initial ping and then have a duration after. Two standouts I could think of were Phantom Pain and Rouse Skeletons. Now, Phantom Pain is a decent spell to do this with, and Rouse Skeletons is nice because it gives you a sustain that you could then carry through on rounds after your Psyche has subsided when you're stupefied, because stupefied doesn't stop you from sustaining a spell. These are nice boosts. Ultimately, I don't think it's going to be game-changing. There were some conscious minds that had better options than Phantom Pain and Rouse Skeletons that would have benefited from this. Two that come to mind are Oscillating Wave that used to have Flame Vortex, and Tangible Dream that used to have Blessed Boundary. Both of those spells were removed from their respective granted spells lists. Oscillating Wave now has Frozen Fog instead, which, as I talked about, doesn't benefit from this change, and I forget what Tangible Dream had to replace with, but it was not a damaging spell at all. And on the note of not benefiting from this change, I've seen some people say Tangible Dream's Astral Rain will benefit from this change. It won't, because Astral Rain does not have an initial ping of damage. So all in all, Occult is just sparse on such spells, and the individual conscious minds don't fix that problem. And then the real question is, do you even want to use a damaging spell with a duration on round 2? Let's take Rouse Skeletons as an example. Spells like Rouse Skeletons are balanced around the idea that you're going to be benefiting from them for a few turns. Usually, if you get at least 3 turns of benefit, including the turn you cast it, it was probably worth casting. If you don't get that much of a benefit, it was better to have cast a one-shot blast in its stead. Because remember, damage up front is generally a bit better than damage over time, unless the combat is going long enough for that damage over time to matter. So ideally, you would want to cast these on turn 1. Sometimes you're going to be in a pickle, you might cast them on turn 2. But will you ever find yourself casting it in the round that you're unleashing your Psyche? I don't think you are. The Psychic is designed to kind of go Nova in the rounds that a Psyche is unleashed. You don't want to be setting up for later turns on the turn that you're unleashing your Psyche. Yes, the use case of having a sustain action for after your Psyche subsides is nice. I would do the Rouse Skeletons before I unleash Psyche though. This is a very minor buff. And then consider Phantom Pain. You could argue that that isn't really set up like Rouse Skeletons is. That is just a good damaging spell that got better. Sure, but now think about it in a practical sense. If you're a Blaster Caster Psychic, you probably have a 2-action amp. So is it better to use Phantom Pain and say a 1-action Psyburst or something like that? Or is it better to spend Phantom Pain's spell slot on a 1-action Force Barrage of the same rank to do the exact same amount of Unleashed Psyche damage that Phantom Pain would have, and then use a 2-action amp, which also benefits from the Psyche damage? I don't think it's a comparison at all. You will always choose the latter. I cannot think of a reason to choose Phantom Pain unless you're in a circumstance where that non-lethal damage matters more. And that's for Blaster Psychics. What if you're a Supportive Psychic? Well, Supportive Psychics are not going to be using their spell slots in Phantom Pain. They're going to be saving them for debuffs and healing spells, not for, like, blasts to do a little bit of damage. They're supports. It's other people's job to do the damage, and if they need to contribute to damage, a cantrip is going to benefit from Unleashed Psyche exactly as much as Phantom Pain is. So the idea that this is a major buff, that it's going to change your play patterns to use duration-dependent spells, during your Unleash Psyche turn, that's a bit of a trap. All this changes is two things. If before you had a stickler of a GM who said days cannot benefit from Unleash Psyche, you can now finally use days as intended. And secondly, if you're in the rare circumstance that you're using a setup spell like Rouse Skeletons on the turn that you have already unleashed your Psyche, it'll feel a little less bad to be doing so. But this is not a case where your ceiling got any better or your use cases were diversified. All that happened is a really feels bad floor was made to feel less bad, feel okay-ish, nothing else. It is a pretty minor change. Now, to clarify some explicit misinformation I have seen floating around about this. First, I have seen some people claim that the wording saying that this only applies to psychic spells and not to, say, innate spells or archetype spells is new. That wording is not new. This is how Unleash Psyche always worked. Feel free to look at Nethys right now and you will see over there that it says this only applies to psychic spellcasting. Likewise, I've seen some people say the stupefied value changed. This is kind of like that Bernstein Bears effect. A lot of people think it used to be stupefied 2 and has become stupefied 1. It was always stupefied 1 for 2 rounds, and that always throws people off. Overall, I would say Unleash Psyche got a really minor change. It's fine. It's a nice way to raise the floor of some of your feels bad turns. It's not much else. I would have liked bigger changes. It's still a fine change. Next up, there was a major change to the amp trait. In terms of the actual words changed, it's really just one sentence that changed, but the functional change is drastic. So previously, amps used to work that as you cast the spell, you would apply a modification as part of the actions to cast that spell. Now, it is a free action you take before you specifically cast a Psi Cantrip. This does have some significant rules implications, but first, let's clarify some misinformation. I have seen people say that the idea that this is mutually exclusive with spell shapes is new. It is not new. It was always mutually exclusive with spell shapes. Spell shapes used to just be called meta magic back then. If you go to the psychic page on Nethys right now and just Control F for the word meta magic, you will see the rule telling you that it doesn't work that way. Now for the actual rules implication of this. The way it is worded now implies that you can only use an amp if your next action is the cast the spell activity to cast the Psi Cantrip. This wasn't the case before. Before, it was part of the actions of casting the spell, so you could embed that into some kind of action compression. Say, you could embed that into a spell strike, which now you can no longer do, because you take the free action to amp, and then your next action must specifically be cast a spell. If you don't do that, if you do spell strike instead, you just waste the amp. Now, spell striking with amps was a centralizing and, in some people's opinion, degenerate interaction because specifically of imaginary weapon and maguses, but this also kills a few other fun interactions. For example, summoners used to be able to act together with psychic amps, and that's no longer possible. Psychics used to be able to use a reaction to cast an amp when the commander used the slip and sizzle tactic. That too is no longer possible. The death of these fun interactions is unfortunate, but surely this is not actually something that affects the psychic class. This is just about how others like the magus, summoner, and commander interact with the psychic class, right? Well, technically no, because this wording technically does not allow you to use an amp on a Psi Cantrip that is already a reaction. That's a reaction at a baseline. The reason I specify that baseline part is because this doesn't kill amped guidance, because if you look at the wording of amped guidance, it is a one-action cantrip that then has additional text that says you can cast amped guidance as a reaction. So once the trigger is met, you are just casting the amped version of guidance in the first place. You're not like casting guidance and then amping it. So guidance specifically sidesteps this issue, but other Psi cantrips don't. For example, the Oscillating Waves Entropic Wheel. Because Entropic Wheel is a reaction, and free actions that don't have a specific trigger cannot be used off turn, you cannot amp Entropic Wheel anymore. Again, this is a wording glitch. Just like that days issue that got fixed by the Unleash Psyche change, no sane GM is going to run it this way. They're either just going to ignore the amp changes entirely, or they'll say it only affects Spell Strike, Act Together, Slip and Sizzle, etc., but does not affect the Psychic's own cantrips. So I don't think you need to worry about this at an actual table, but it is a little funny that they missed the wording issue on this. Overall, I'd say this is barely a real change for the Psychic class. It is a major change for archetyped Psychics, people who are archetyping into Psychic, but the Psychic is not going to notice the change because there aren't that many reaction Psi Cantrips in the first place. The most important of them, Guidance, fully sidesteps the issue without any ambiguity, and in the rare cases where this will matter, your GM is hopefully not crazy about it and just makes the right call of letting you use your own class features, right? So overall, barely a change. Still worth going over though, because there's a lot of discussion surrounding it. Next up, let's talk about Psi Cantrip Changes. Full disclosure, as far as I can tell, only 4 Psi Cantrips changed. I poured over every line of text. If you think I missed something, please let me know, but I don't think I have. Of those 4 changes, 2 are incredibly minor, 1 is pretty nice, and then 1 is a significant nerf, and in my opinion, an unjustifiable one. Let's get into them one by one. First up, Vector Screen. Vector Screen is one of the minor changes. This spell lets you create a little area that affects projectiles, blocks small ones entirely, and imposes a penalty to larger ones, and at higher levels, it even imposes a penalty to non-physical projectiles. This is a very situational ability, but it's nice when it does come up. The buff is that it used to be a 5-foot square, but now it's a 10-foot line. To be clear, it's a line that can be placed in any orientation at a 60-foot range. It doesn't have to come directly from you in 10 feet. So it's a pretty flexible area and much bigger than it used to be. And it heightens to being 20 feet long, whereas previously it used to heighten to being 10 feet after having started at 5. A decent buff to a situational spell. I will also note that it has that special thing where if you dismiss the amped version, you get to cast Telekinetic Projectile. You may not be allowed to amp that TKP depending on how your GM interprets the amp changes in the previous slide. So talk to them about that. Next up, Imaginary Weapon. And I am unhappy about this change. Imaginary Weapon used to deal 2d8 damage. It would heighten by 1d8 at a baseline, and amping it would make the heightening 2d8. Instead, it now deals 2d6 and heightens by d6s. This is a pretty substantial nerf. You went from dealing 9 average damage per rank to 7 average damage per rank. This is a substantial nerf, and in my opinion, not a necessary one. I don't really know why it was nerfed. My best guess is that it's a reactionary nerf to bring the Magus under control when they archetype into Psychic. But one, I don't believe the Magus needed this nerf in the first place because the build that archetypes into Psychic wasn't as centralizing as the online discourse pretended it was. And secondly, even if the Magus needed this nerf, you shouldn't be nerfing Psychic options for Psychics to then indirectly nerf the Magus. And thirdly, the amp changes on the previous slide disallow this interaction anyways, so I can't imagine why somebody would want this to be nerfed for the Psychic itself. And here's where I will be talking about another bit of misinformation. There are some people who are saying this is not a nerf. They're saying it's a side grade because the damage type changed to Force, and Force is a really good damage type, right? This is still a nerf. That's for a variety of reasons. The damage type used to be your choice of either bludgeoning or slashing. That means you would choose what you consider the better of the two, bludgeoning or slashing. That is almost as good as Force. It is very rare for something to resist both bludgeoning and slashing. Something resisting both bludgeoning and piercing is relatively common, like skeletons do it. Slashing and piercing, also common. But you'll notice that bludgeoning and slashing are often presented as opposites, where if something resists the other pair, then this one is okay. And bludgeoning and slashing rarely pair up to be a bad damage type together. The major exceptions are things like incorporeal enemies, which are resistant to all damage except force, vitality, and ghost touch. And of course, you cannot put ghost touch on a spell. Or creatures like devils that are resistant to all physical damage that does not come from a silvered weapon. So yes, technically, force is going to let you bypass a few more resistances because bludgeoning and slashing will run into those resistances. Incorporeal enemies, devils, and similar creatures, right? Except that's not the full story. First, let's talk about the value of the resistance itself. The way creatures are built, when something has a really wide-ranging resistance, their resistance tends to have a small value. This is to make sure they don't become overly punishing for a party that doesn't have a way around that damage, right? And resistance to all damage except the incorporeal silver bullets is one of those wide damage types. So incorporeal creatures have a really small resistance typically. Likewise, resistance to all physical damage except silver is a broad-ranging resistance. It's also typically a small value. In fact, the value is typically so small that it's going to almost get outweighed by the nerf in the damage. Between levels 1 and 20, take a sample of what an amped imaginary weapon would do. Look at the resistance of what a ghost that is a minion to you, a ghost that is on your level, and a ghost that is a boss to you. Compare the 3 different resistances. You will notice that in the vast majority of cases, their resistance is about equal to the damage you lost from having your 2d8 down to a 2d6. The only exception I found from a quick look was if you are in the level range of 1 to 4 and you're fighting a boss type ghost. Only boss type. If they're a standard equal to your level enemy, it's not going to be the case. If they're below your level, it's actually definitely not going to be the case. It would have just been better to do 2d8 damage and lose some of that to their resistance. So the resistance thing is barely ever going to matter in the first place because resistance to both bludgeoning and slashing is rare. And then when it matters, in most cases, it's going to be outweighed by the damage die decrement. And in the few cases where it's not outweighed, it's going to be like a few points of damage. But sure, you could still argue that force is the strictly better damage type. Except it's not, because force has another downside compared to bludgeoning or slashing. Force never triggers weaknesses. There are 2 creatures in the game that have a force weakness. There are way more creatures that have either a bludgeoning or a slashing weakness. For example, anytime you fight a zombie, the previous version of imaginary weapon is going to be way better. It's going to do more damage at a baseline and then trigger a big weakness. So all in all, this change is a nerf. There are people saying that losing 2 average damage per rank justifies changing your damage type to force. It does not. Bludgeoning or slashing is arguably as good a damage type as force, maybe slightly worse depending on the campaign you're in, but the amount it's worse is really small, completely outweighed by the damage die decrement. It is unfortunately just a nerf. Saying it's secretly a side grade is unfortunately spreading misinformation. Next up, a change to Phase Bolt. And it wasn't the Psi Cantrip version of Phase Bolt itself that changed, it was the base Phase Bolt that changed. It got its range doubled. It used to be 30 feet, it is now 60 feet. This is a good change for all occult casters. Phase Bolt is a good cantrip. It is now on the level of Needle Darts, which was previously the go-to cantrip for long-range ping from occult casters. At 60 feet, this is a pretty good option to have because it helps you ignore cover and ignore raised shields and other such circumstances. The change to the baseline cantrip is going to carry through for Unbound Stepped Psychics, so this is going to be a meaningful buff to their performance. And finally, Distortion Lens. And please, go ahead, pause the video, take a good long look at the spell, because it is not a great cantrip. It never really was. The base version just increases the range of attacks by an additional 10 feet on your side and decrementing it 10 feet for enemies, but only if they're not in the area itself and they actually know that their range is decremented before they make the shot, so it's not like you can disrupt an attack that they made from the edge of their range. The baseline version is really not good. The amped version is okay, It lets medium or smaller allies move through it with an additional 5 feet of movement that is technically like an untyped bonus. And conversely, it is difficult terrain for enemies. This spell is incredibly niche and is not even that good in those incredibly niche circumstances where it pops up. In my opinion, when something is niche, it should be really good in those circumstances. But it's only like fine in those circumstances. Either way, it did technically get buffed. It used to be 1 5-foot square, it's now a 5-foot burst, which means you get a whole 4 5-feet squares. I guess that's a bit of a reasonable buff for the amped version, because now that's 4 squares of difficult terrain for your enemies instead of 1 square of difficult terrain. And likewise, your friend has more combinations they can get more movement through, but it's so minor. And then it got the buff in that the amped version gets a locked 1-minute duration and no longer needs to be sustained. That's meaningful. That means if you open on the first turn of combat, it might help speed up your friends, slow down your enemies, but then it also locks the positioning. This is a spell that at a baseline, you can move it when you sustain, but once you lose a sustain, you're also not allowed to move it. It stays still. It doesn't even give you the option to sustain it to move it. So somehow, even this buff is like more of a side grade. It's still a buff. It's just that it's a really minor buff to a really situational spell that is really not even that good in the situations it's built for. Unbound Step Psychics are actually pretty good. That one cantrip, though, is really not. So there you have it. 2 small buffs, 1 nice buff, and 1 needless and significant nerf. Next up, let's talk about some of the changes to feats. First up, we'll be talking about Violent Unleash. The way this used to work was that it was a free action you took as you unleashed your Psyche, and then it inflicted stunned 1 on you. Now it costs that action up front immediately after you unleash your Psyche, and then it does not stun you. On the surface, this looks like nothing really changed, but depending on how your table interprets the stunned rules, it's either a bit of a nerf or a massive buff. Let me explain. Stunned has this weird thing where the first line of rules text in it, so after it says you've become senseless, it says you can't act. Can't act is a rules term. It's properly defined. It means you're not allowed to take any of your actions. So if you're at one of those tables where it means getting stunned 1 in your own turn means you immediately lose your turn, this is obviously better because now you're not going to lose your whole turn to do 2d6 force damage and heighten by 1d6 every couple levels. That being said, most tables don't rule stunned that way because it just doesn't really make much sense to rule it that way. If you follow a somewhat arbitrary reading of we're sticking to rules as written, but we're ignoring the fact that interrupting someone's turn with stunned just ends the turn, then you would end up with the fact that once you're stunned 1, you can take 3 actions on your turn. You don't have a reaction until the start of your next turn. You lose stunned, and then you gain a reaction. So you would get 2 actions on that next turn, and you would have lost the reaction along the way. So now you're trading 1 action up front for a reaction and 1 action from later. I would say that's a bit of a wash. 1 action now is more valuable than 1 action later, but I'd say 1 action now is about as valuable as a reaction and an action from later. So a bit of a wash there. And finally, there are some tables that house rule these 2 interpretations of stunned to sort of work together by just letting stunned count down in the middle of your turn. In that case, this is a complete non-change. You lose the action by spending it on the feat rather than having it counted down from stunned. But there's one minor exception. If you were already stunned or slowed for any reason, the previous version of Violent Unleash was actually really nice because stunned doesn't stack with stunned. Like if you're stunned 1 and become stunned 1 again, it's still stunned 1. And in fact, it doesn't stack with slowed either. So the old Violent Unleash had a really nice worst case scenario that it was really good in, but overall, you're not really going to perceive a difference in most cases. Next up, Whispering Steps. This is an amp that lets you target an enemy and force them to move. Previously, it forced them to step. Now it lets you make them stride half their speed in a direction of your choosing. It is still forced movement, so it's not allowed to trigger reactions, and it's not going to let you force the creature to hazardous terrain or off a ledge. I know many GMs house rule away that latter part and allow force movement to do these things, in which case this will be really nice at your tables. It'll be nice at my table because I do have that house rule, but it's still not going to trigger a reaction. Even without that house rule though, even with all the restrictions in place, striding half an enemy's speed is actually really nice. You can use it to force an enemy that has dived the backline back into the front line. You can use it to get them away from a fragile frontliner into a tanky frontliner, or away from an injured one into a fresh one, or maybe they go immediately after you, so you just force them away and they're just going to have to waste an action striding back up into melee. It is a nice amp. That being said, a lot of the amp feats in the levels 1 to 12 range tend to not be very good offensively. The supportive amps are actually genuinely good, but the offensive ones don't tend to be great. So Whispering Step is decent for an offensive amp, but I would rather pick other level 6 and level 8 feats over it. For example, this feat is competing with Strain Mind and Parallel Breakthrough. Both of those are way better than Whispering Steps in my opinion, and I wouldn't consider it in most cases. Then there's a new feat called Amp Focus. It's a level 12 feat that says you can spend 10 minutes to regain all your focus points. Psychics have a special thing where they can get 2 focus points back in 10 minutes rather than taking 20 for it. It's a very minor buff over other spellcasters that use focus points, and this makes it 10 minutes for 3 focus points. This is a feat that's going to feel nice in a minority of games where 10-minute intervals tend to be heavily attrition, like tight dungeon crawls where enemies react in realistic ways, but otherwise it's not a particularly useful feat. It's fairly niche. It does replace the previous version of this feat that used to be level 18, and that's now just gone, and it's really nice to not have to spend a freaking level 18 feat on this. Next up, Twin Psyche. This is the feat that doubles the duration of Unleashed Psyche. It just got moved to level 18. It used to be level 20. Then at level 20, we have a new feat, and this is a genuinely powerful feat. It makes you permanently quickened, and you can use the additional action only for Psyche actions. But by this point, you have a lot of good Psyche actions. I mean, you could have the level 10 Psyche action that just lets you have a +2 status bonus to all your attack rolls. Some of the baseline Psyche actions are also pretty good, like the one that lets you aid your friends. You will basically get a free legendary proficiency aid every single turn that applies within 30 feet and applies to anyone who makes an attack, not just one person, if you're in that subconscious mind. So this is a great feat. That being said, I don't think Psychics needed help with their feats in the level 16 to 20 range. They have fantastic feats over there. I was hoping for more changes in the level 1 to 12 range. Unfortunate that we didn't get much of those. This is still a fantastic feat though. Finally, Become Thought, which was already a good feat, has got a buff. It no longer imposes a weakness to spirit damage. That's genuinely very nice. So if you're playing a high-level Psychic, you're actually gonna find a pretty substantial boost to your performance. Like getting Twin Psyche and then one of these 2 level 20 feats, pretty fantastic, and you're gonna feel the difference. But if you're playing a Psychic in the levels 1 to 12 range, where a lot of your amps feel a little mediocre, and some of the Psyche actions feel meh, and some of those emanations feel like they should have not had friendly fire, unfortunately it's not gonna feel great. Overall, it's still fine, because the Psychic has a lot of good feats sprinkled throughout the levels. It just also has a lot of bad feats. It's not like you're gonna struggle to pick a good feat at any level as a Psychic. Even if you never archetype out of the class, you will still have good feats from levels 1 to 20, so that hasn't changed. Next up, the changes to the archetype. This is a quick change to cover, but has major implications. First, Psychic Dedication got changed. It no longer gives you a Psi Cantrip, its amp, and a focus point to go with it. That is no longer the case. Instead, it just gives you 1 Psi Cantrip. Now, Psi Cantrips tend to be stronger than a normal cantrip, with a few exceptions. That being said, this does make the second level feat weaker than a lot of caster dedications, which give you 2 cantrips, or perhaps, say, a cantrip and a familiar, or something along those lines. Psychic Dedication went from being one of the best dedications for a spellcaster to being arguably one of the worst. And how do you get the amp? You get it at level 6 via Psi development. The way it works is now you gain a second Psi Cantrip, you get the amp for this Psi Cantrip as well as your previous one, and you gain 1 focus point, not 2. The wording here says you don't gain a focus point if you already had focus points, which feels too bad to be true, so I have to assume it's a glitch. So I'm just running it as you get +1 focus points up to a maximum of 3 instead. This is substantial. A lot of builds would go through Psychic Dedication for power reasons because it was really nice for pretty much any spellcaster, but especially intelligence and charisma-based ones, to just get a free focus spell from the Psychic. This would usually be Amped Guidance, Amped Shield, Amped Warp Step, or Amped Ignition. Now you don't get the amp, so you could still pursue the Psychic for thematic reasons. Say you're trying to build a 5e style Abjuration Wizard, you might still go for Amped Shield, but you're not going to get it to level 6. I would say from a power perspective, this is not worth really taking in a non-free archetype game, because level 6 feat slots tend to be precious. In a free archetype game, you'll barely perceive a change other than how late things come online, because your archetype feats feel pretty cheap at that point. In my opinion, a nerf to the dedication was warranted. It was a little too free. It ate the Psychic's lunch a little too much, and I'm happy that the dedication got nerfed. So what's the final verdict on the Psychic? What does the overall class and archetype look like once you look at the sum total of changes in context rather than random snippets on Reddit and Discord? First, we'll talk about the base class, ignoring the archetype for now. Overall, you'll barely feel a difference from playing a Legacy Psychic, unless you were playing without the remaster compatibility errata, which, if you were, you're in for some drastic changes. Like, Oscillating Wave gets much better if you go from Rare Frost to Frostbite. But if we compare the Psychic with the errata, because that errata has been out for well over a year now, to what the Dark Archive Remastered gave us, you'll barely feel a difference. Tangible Dream is gonna feel noticeably worse. It's not gonna kill your build, but it's gonna feel drastically worse than before every single time you use Amped Imaginary Weapon, even when you're running into resistances you would otherwise have bypassed, especially if you're running into weaknesses you would otherwise have exploited. So Tangible Dream is gonna feel worse. It's not a dead option, but it's certainly worse than it ever was. Unbound Step is gonna feel noticeably better, though not by as much as, say, Tangible Dream got worse. The changes to Phase Bolt are very nice. Doubling the range feels really good. I will also add that high level play is probably going to feel even better for your Psychic, because some of those high level feats are really good now. But otherwise, very little has changed from before. Oscillating Wave was one of the strongest blasters in the game. It still is one of the strongest blasters in the game. It got a few QOL upgrades and downgrades in the spell list as well. For example, they now get Blazing Bolt at rank 2 rather than Heat Metal, and that's really nice. On the other hand, they lost Flame Vortex, which would have worked really well with the new version of Unleashed Psyche and had it replaced with Frozen Fog. And they lost Fiery Body, which was not amazing, but felt really good and really cool, and they had it replaced with Volcanic Eruption, which is pretty good, but it's more of a one-shot blast, which Psychics don't tend to have the spell slots for. Overall, Oscillating Wave will not have felt much of a change. Infinite Eye, it used to be an excellent support. It still is. I know Infinite Eye is an unpopular option, but in my opinion, it's just a very powerful and competent support option. Supports just tend to get overshadowed because everyone's just like Maestro Bard, Healing Font Cleric, but other support options exist, and they're good. And in my opinion, the Infinite Eye Psychic is one of them. Always has been, still is. Silent Whisper and Distant Grasp, they continue to be good all-rounders as they've always been. So very little has changed from before. And as before, Psychics will continue to struggle in longer adventuring days. I was hoping we would see something to address that just a little bit. I know a lot of people wanted Psychic to become a 3-slot caster rather than a 2-slot caster, though that's not what I personally wanted. But unfortunately, we have not really seen any longevity changes. Psychics have always been one of those casters where if you're able to get 10 minutes between each combat, you're going to feel really nice because you're refocusing most or all of your focus points. Your Unleashed Psyche is usable, and you don't really have to use spell slots. But if you tend to have, say, a lot of back-to-back encounters, if you tend to have really long encounters with waves of enemies, which perhaps you're stupefied through portions of because of using Unleashed Psyche on an earlier wave, and if you run into situations where you just really want that max rank spell slot a lot, then you will continue to struggle as you always have. What about the archetype? What changes for that? The dedication change is good. It was genuinely overtuned in my opinion. In fact, it was so overtuned that I think despite the Psychic not getting very many buffs overall, we are still going to see more Psychics than we used to. Because anytime you built a Psychic before, there was always the question of, both on a mechanical level and a thematic one, isn't it better for me to be another intelligence or charisma spellcaster and then just pick up the Psychic archetype? Because the Psychic dedication gives you so much that you thematically feel like you're getting that little bit of Psychic niche that you want, and then you're getting to have more powerful mechanics from some other class. Now that that's no longer a consideration, we'll probably see more Psychics than before, despite the Psychic not getting some much needed improvements. And then secondly, some people are saying the Magus was indirectly nerfed a lot because of these changes. It wasn't. The Magus never needed to go through the Psychic to be a good class. Single class Maguses with no archetype attached to them are good. Maguses archetyping into the Wizard are also good. Maguses archetyping into the Witch are also good. Maguses archetyping into Druid or Cleric are also good. And in some combinations, they can actually get a focus spell that is almost as powerful as Amped Imaginary Weapon. So even if you specifically want to centralize on spell striking with focus spells, you still can. And if you thought that was the only way to play a Magus, it never was. And so the Magus has not been nerfed. It's just one specific interaction that got disallowed. So all things considered, very little is going to change other than the fact that we're going to see more Psychics now because the dedication is way weaker than it used to be. And finally, I have talked about how much I think the Psychic needed some changes. I feel like it's only fair if I'm clear about what level of changes I think the Psychic wanted. There are many people who say the Psychic needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, or it needed this huge array of changes like becoming a 3-slot caster and getting better focus spells. I never thought the Psychic needed that many changes. Every change that was on my wish list was something that I think would have easily fit within the page space constraints of something like Guns and Gears or Dark Archive Remastered. If you wish to, you could take this wish list as a suggestion of house rules for your own game if you think the Psychic is too weak. But again, I don't really think the Psychic is too weak, and I'm not really going to bother house ruling stuff because house ruling comes with the effort of making sure everyone's on the same page of how to use it in Path Builder, for example, right? So I will be running the Psychic raw, but you can use this wish list as house rules if you like. First, changes for the base class. The first thing I would have liked is for Unleashed Psyche to get the change it got for duration spells, because it does improve the floor a little bit, but also to add to healing the way Sorceress Potency does. I am genuinely surprised this was not a change that we got, because it's very easy to fit it within the restrictions of a remastered book. So yeah, that is the first change I would want. Secondly, I would have liked minor tweaks to many of the low-level and mid-level amps and Psyche actions. For example, I would want Warp Space to have a special tag that lets it work on all Psychic spellcasting, not just Psi Cantrips. I've seen some people say all of the feat-based amps should have that tag. I strongly disagree. I think many of them are strong enough on their own, but Warp Space definitely needed that tag because it's really just like a slightly improved reach spell that only works with like a handful of cantrips, and that is not that good in my opinion. Secondly, some of the Psyche actions, for example, Psi Burst, I would have liked that to become D6s rather than D4s to justify using it over many of the other really good options you have during your Psyche being unleashed. Psi Strikes, the one that adds bonus damage to your weapon, I would have liked it to become D8 and then only work while unleashed and to ignore the part where it works right after casting a spell. It only works while unleashed. Basically, I would want a broader variety of Psyche actions that have a bit more oomph to them at lower levels. And finally, Violent Unleash and Dark Persona's Presence are two really cool and thematic feats that are also really difficult to use because they create emanations that are really big. And so they often inflict your friends with friendly fire. I would have liked to have some ability to avoid friendly fire. Maybe not eliminate it entirely because friendly fire is thematically appropriate, but maybe something like you can choose creatures to have 1 degree of success better or something along those lines. I don't know. Maybe that's too much to wish for. And then finally, I would have liked Strain Mind to become a baseline feature. I consider it a mandatory level 6 feat for the Psychic because it is effectively a 4th focus point. The Necromancer gets their 4th focus point for free at level 1. They just have to consume a Thrall for it. So I would have liked to see the Psychic get the same treatment. This, in fact, does make me wonder if the Necromancer is going to lose that ability once the final release comes out, because why would they not give it to the Psychic if they thought the Necromancer deserved it? And then for the Archetype, because while I do think the dedication deserved to be nerfed, I don't think the whole Archetype deserved to be nerfed by as much as it did. So I would have nerfed the dedication the exact same way, in fact, and perhaps I would have added a thing that unique Psi Cantrips are completely inaccessible via the Archetype, but I would have wanted there to be some level 4 feat that you can use to just get your dedication Psi Cantrip amped, and to get a focus point for that amp. I don't think that's unfair. Psychic focus spells, perhaps in Legacy, were way above par for caster focus spells, but they aren't any longer. Psychic focus spells are now only a little bit ahead of the average focus spell, and there are some powerful things you can access by level 4 via other casting archetypes. For example, if you take the Witch archetype, you can get Cackle by level 4. I don't really think taking a Psychic amp by level 4 would have been a big issue, so it's a little annoying that you have to wait till level 6 for it, but ultimately I'm not too upset about the archetype changes. I imagine the changes were as minimal as possible in terms of wording to make sure they didn't change the page count in any way. So this is what my overall wish list was. This is sort of where my expectations were when I say that I think Paizo's treatment of the Psychic goes a little under par, because I don't think any of these were too major. They're all relatively minor changes, and even a few of the class changes I asked for would have been fine. But we saw almost none of them get delivered on. And we saw a lot of work done in places where I think the Psychic didn't need to work, like better level 18 and 20 feats. So this is what I'm referencing when I say I think Paizo sort of missed the mark with what I wanted the Psychic to be treated as. So there you have it, folks. That is pretty much everything I could see that got changed for the Psychic. There might be a couple other minor things I missed, but I promise you I went through the rules with a fine-tooth comb. Some of the changes are good, some of them are unwarranted. Overall, the class is mostly in the same place. Anyone telling you the sky is falling is lying to you. Anyone who tells you that they got some massive buffs that we're overlooking is coping. Unfortunately, they did not get any massive buffs. The Psychic is mostly the same as before, and the dedication got a lot worse, which might mean we'll see more Psychics than before, but that doesn't mean Psychics got buffed. That is all for today's video, folks. I hope you enjoyed the little preview. I hope I have helped to assuage some of the fears that have been coming out from a lot of the discussion in the online community, and I hope I have given you a good picture of what the Psychic looks like now. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Consider joining a channel membership as a way to directly support me and to get a few perks for yourself. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Mathfinder out.